Hit it. It's July 3rd, 2020, episode 87. I'm Patrick Ceresna.
And I'm Kevin Muir. This week, we changed up the format for the holiday weekend. We're featuring 2 back-to-back interviews, but don't worry, we will return to our normal show format next week. We start off with Patrick interviewing the Rebel Capitalist George Gammon, and then Harris is in the house for fan favorite Kuppy's Corner, where we talk about selling volatility in this crazy mixed up macro environment, and Harris tells us what stocks he is buying right now.
Okay, it's time for our first interview. I'm joined by Rebel Capitalist George Gammon. We're going to talk about real estate, the Fed, QE, and more. Welcome to the show, George.
Patrick, I am super stoked to be here. I love the show. I cannot wait to deliver some value to your audience. I'm really excited. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Well, you know what, George, I was looking forward to this. I always enjoy our conversations. So let's jump into it. But before, I know we're going to talk Fed and QE and bailouts and all sorts of great stuff. But you know what? Very few people ever get to hear your story. How did you get into all of this? Why don't we start off? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? How did you get in the business?
Well, I grew up in Portland, Oregon. And back in the 70s and 80s, it was a lot different back then. There wasn't as much Antifa, believe it or not,
right.
back in the 70s and 80s in Portland, Oregon. But I played a lot of sports growing up. I played ice hockey, which I'm sure you can appreciate being Canadian. What was funny about that is I was on the All-Star team when I was in Pee-wees. And for those people that might not know what age group that is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Patrick, but I think it's 10 or 11 to 14, is it? Or 12
something
to 14?
Like that, yeah.
Something. Anyway, we were in Pee-wees, and I was on our all-star team for Portland. You had to try out for it and everything. So it's kind of a big deal. You know, you make it, you feel like a big shot. And we would go up and play Spokane and Seattle, and we would do very well. And then occasionally we would take a road trip up to Canada. And then we would get the dose or the dish of humble pie handed to us. We would think we're big stuff. We would go up there and just get rocked like 15-0. And we went to Burnaby a few times in Victoria. And so whenever we go to Canada, we would just
Canadians take their hockey pretty seriously. It's
boy.
It's a whole new level.
It sure is. It sure is. So I just played a lot of sports growing up. And in high school, I was just a terrible, terrible student. In fact, I tell people all the time that I almost flunked out of high school. I remember my final semester, I had my whole entire report card, I think it was 2 Ds and 2 Fs. And the only reason I got the 2 Ds is because those were the 2 classes I needed to graduate. So I was a horrible, horrible student. I actually did go to college, though. I went to college on an athletic scholarship. If you want to call golf athletics, I don't know if you want to go that far. Most people wouldn't really consider it a sport. But if you do, then I went to college on an athletic scholarship. And I actually did a little bit better in college as far as grades go. But then when I got out of college, first thing I did is I started a business. It was a T-shirt business. And I was working valet at the Golden Nugget in Vegas.
Nice.
And I was working the graveyard shift because that would give me time during the day to work on my T-shirt business. And I could just take all the tips from what I made working valet and just invest that into the business. So I was doing that. Of course, I didn't make any money, and that kind of went belly up. But that was my first shot at being an entrepreneur, and I just stuck with it. I worked for a couple of different groups and just kind of went back and forth, just learning how to become better in business. And then I started consulting in the early 2000s. This was with radio advertising, writing radio copy, which now helps me out quite a bit with the YouTube channel. And just had some successes. I had some failures. The last business that I started was in 2008, and we were fortunate enough to grow that to 24 million in revenues. And 2012, I had grown that business all over the world, pretty much every English-speaking country you can think of. And I was on a flight from LA to Australia. and about a 14-hour flight. And I had built this monster, and I had become a slave to the monster. And what I'm referring to is the business.
Right.
And this was not my first business. I started and took over many of them, but this was kind of the last one, and it turned out to be the biggest. But I had over 100 employees at the time, believe it or not. And I just realized that I had a lot less personal freedom than I did when I was in college, and I didn't have two nickels to rub together. So I thought to myself, what's the point of making all this money when you have less freedom? I mean, isn't that the point?
Yeah.
And I had a mentor, if you want to call it that, a guy that I partnered with on a couple deals. And this was back when I was in my early 30s. And so I was very young for what I was doing at the time. And he was in his late 60s. He was a former CEO of some companies in Silicon Valley, insurance companies. And he always said to me, money can't buy happiness, but it buys you a hell of a lot of freedom. So if you're someone who is happier, the more free you are, then there's obviously a correlation there with the amount of money you're making. So anyway, on that flight, I said, listen, I need to take some time off. So I was going to take 6 months off, and I just ended up just calling it quits. And I retired when I was 38 years old in 2012. And then I was fortunate to have a decent amount of money, but I knew that I needed to invest it well so I wouldn't have to ever work again if I didn't want to. And I knew nothing about investing. And when I say nothing, I mean zero. I didn't know what the Fed was. I didn't know what a yield curve was. I didn't even know what interest rates were. I'd never owned a piece of property. I knew nothing except for how to make money in business. And I did that well, but unfortunately, you're moving on to the next stage of life. So I just dove into every type of investment philosophy or anything on YouTube or podcasts that I could get my hands on. And I was in the Marina Bay Sands in Singapore. I was there. It's one of my favorite hotels. I love Singapore. I was about 15 minutes before I was supposed to meet someone for dinner. And I was in my hotel room, remember it like it was yesterday, on YouTube. And I stumbled across a video from Milton Friedman's Free to Choose series. And it just blew me away. I mean, I just was almost in a state of shock because he was articulating so well everything that had been in my head for so long and all the experiences that I had as not only an entrepreneur and an employer, but also an employee when I was in college. And that just took me right down the rabbit hole. From Friedman, I went to Thomas Sowell. And then I started getting into more of the investors that kind of see things in that way, the Austrian school type investors, if you will. So guys like Schiff, Jim Rogers, Jim Grant, Jim Rickards, Doug Casey, Rick Rule, all these guys. And I was hooked. I was hooked. And when I get into something, I get just completely OCD on it. So if I'm in the shower,
welcome to the club.
Breakfast, if I'm jogging, if I'm in the gym, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. I'm listening to a podcast like Macro Voices or a Real Vision. And back then it was audiobooks and YouTube interviews with Jim Rogers or Mark Faber. And I thought, okay, this really resonates with me. So then I stumbled across a chart, and this is before I got to investing. Now we're maybe mid 2012. I stumbled across a chart of the Japanese housing market going back prior to their bust in 1990. And I saw that from the top to the bottom, they lost about 60%. And if you remember, this was the time when the U.S. market was still actually going down, and people thought real estate was the worst investment in the world. It's going to keep going down. No one's going to touch real estate with a 10-foot pole. Banks were selling foreclosure properties and short sales and all these things for pennies on the dollar. And it was just a hated asset class. It's almost like uranium is now or something like that.
Right.
And so I pulled up a chart of the United States housing market. And I saw, going all the way back to 1900, when you adjust for inflation, the size of the home, that we were almost bouncing on our historic trend line. So I thought, okay, well, this housing stuff is kind of like, it might be cheap. Like Jim Rogers would probably be interested in something like this because there's blood in the streets and people are giving it away. That was honestly my mindset. So I compared that to the chart of Japan. I thought, well, my downside's probably on 10% because that's what happened to Japan. And if I'm buying it for the cash flow, well, what do I care what happens to the price of the asset? I'm not planning on selling it. So if I can get super cheap cash flow at 10 or 12 or even 14% return using no leverage, and I can build some equity by buying some piece of crap property from the bank, but then dropping 25 on a remodel. So now you've got that forced equity, if they want, or forced appreciation, the real estate guys would call it. And I thought, well, this is probably a good deal. So that's what got me into real estate investing. And the very first thing I did is I went to Kansas City. I had some friends there. That's another long story. I was dating a gal. She was a model up in New York City, but her family was from Kansas City. So that was kind of an equal point because I was in Vegas. She was there, so we'd always meet in Kansas City. Anyway, her family was in the construction business, and they were telling me about all these tax foreclosure homes you could get for like $5,000. And I'm like, $5,000 for a house? I'm like, what's the catch? You know, why is everyone not going there bidding up the price? So I did some research. I found out why you could get a house for $5,000 because you're probably overpaying for it. And but I thought, okay, this could be cool. So I went to the gal's family. I said, listen, you guys do all the work. I'll put up the money. I'll buy the properties. I'll put up all the money for the rehab, and then we'll split profits. And they said, yeah, that sounds fantastic. So we went to the first tax foreclosure auction, and that's when the county forecloses on someone for not paying their property taxes. Right. And I bought 6 houses. Boom, done. And a funny story about that is prior to doing, I'd never done this before. So doing due diligence, I went to the person that's in charge there for the county. I said, okay, well, how does this work? They explained it to me. And they said, if you win the auction, if you're the high bidder, right then and there, you've got to pay cash. And if you don't have the money, you don't pay right then and there, then it just goes to the next bidder. And I said,
right.
Well,
like what? Okay. So like literally like a bag full of cash? Like you.
Well, see, you're thinking the same thing I did. That's what I thought. So yeah. I fortunately or not, whatever, I had a bunch of cash back in Vegas in my safe. And so I went back to Vegas and I'm like, okay, I'm going to allocate like $150,000 to this. So I took like $200,000. I put it in a backpack. And at the time, I had 2 vehicles. I agree with a motorcycle. I had this Mercedes, an AMG Mercedes, and then I had what I had at the time. Oh, and then I had a Ferrari. I had a Ferrari, a convertible Ferrari. And what happened is just before I went, I noticed the tags on my Mercedes were expired. I'm like, listen, I don't want to take my Mercedes because you got $200,000 in a bag. I mean, who knows what happens? And I already had a gun with me, just in case, because you start to wonder about, man, people kill other people for like $10,000. So if someone found out I had $200,000 right here in a backpack, that might not be good. So I'm like, there's no way I can take the Mercedes, but I just bought my mom a smart car. You know what those are?
I've heard of them.
Those little teeny weeny things that you see them in Italy all the time. And like, I mean,
the tires are like only like 1 foot diameter type of thing. Like
yeah, just small little tiny. It looks like a slice of cheese or like a Rubik's cube with like a little couple wheels on it, right? So I'm like,
so you're taking this thing and you're packing a gun with $200,000. Like, you're looking for a drug deal or something.
Yeah, and I threw it in the back of the smart car, and I drove the smart car to Kansas City from Vegas, right? But what dawned on me when I was driving the smart car, I'd go by a cop, Patrick, at like 80 miles per hour over the speed limit in the U.S. And you look at, and when you see that cop, you're like, oh shoot, he's gonna get me. He's got me. And then you're always looking through your rear view mirror to see if he pulls out. And the first time that happened, the cop didn't do anything, and it dawned on me like, this is the perfect vehicle. Like nobody is ever going to expect something that's happening or I'm doing anything wrong or I've got cash
with a little tiny
smart car, it's like the nerdiest hipster kind of millennial car on the planet Earth. So they're not going to expect me of doing anything. So anyway, I got it to Kansas City. First day of the auction, I had this $200,000 in cash in my bag roughly. And I was bidding on a property. I won it. Right. And I think I paid like 30 grand for it or something like that. So I go up to and it's the courthouse steps. It's very similar to what you would imagine or what you see on TV. On the courthouse steps, they set up a little table right next to the auctioneer where they've got the actual titles or the slips of your receipt so you can get the title for the house. And you go up there. So I went up there, bam, put my backpack down on the table, and I start breaking out this cash. And everyone's looking at me like, what is this guy doing? And they had these security guys, and they're kind of like whispering back and forth. I'm like, this is what I'm supposed to do, right? And then this guy, taps me on the shoulder. He's like, dude, you're not supposed to bring cash. I'm like, that's what the gal told me to. They had, no, you bring cashier's checks. I'm like, oh, sorry about that. So then, of course, everyone, the 20 or 30 people that are there bidding, then all of a sudden I go back once I get the property. I have this big backpack, and they know that it's just jam-packed full of cash. So everyone's kind of looking at me weird. But that was the funny story of my my initiation into real estate investing.
That's hilarious. And so now... and then since then, I mean, that was what, back 2012 or something like that?
Yeah, that was 2012. And I just figured out the real estate game. I did a few flips. I kept a lot of properties in a rental portfolio. A lot of those properties I actually still have. And when I was an entrepreneur, I made quite a bit of money overseas. And so when I figured out the real estate game in the US, the natural progression for me was like, listen, if I can increase my margins, if I can get a better ROI outside the United States, I'm game. So, and I love to travel. I've been over to over 40 countries. I've lived all over the place. So that was a very easy transition for me. So I went down to South America because now all of a sudden I'm starting to learn more and more about macro as I'm doing the real estate stuff. And I thought that we would get some inflation and the CPI was understated. So we had all these these baby boomers retiring. And I thought their purchasing power is going to get squeezed. So they might look to move outside of the United States to increase their standard of living or their purchasing power if they're on fixed income, like Social Security. So I went down to Ecuador, and that seemed to be a good fit. But that's when I made the biggest mistake that I've ever made in investing. And I'm so glad that I made it. I got my butt handed to me. But it really helped solidify my framework that I have today for investing that I've used very successfully. And the mistake I made back then, because I didn't know any different, is I saw an asset class that was increasing in value that was pretty hot. And it definitely wasn't hated. It definitely wasn't cheap. But I felt as though it was going to get a lot more expensive. Right. And so I went ahead and bought it. I bought a bunch of oceanfront property in Ecuador. Well, as it turns out, that was not a good play. They had an earthquake or volcano. They had a new president come in. And I've got some of the property, but the property that I've actually sold and liquidated, I've taken a massive haircut, probably a 50% haircut on it. And the big mistake that I made there is I bought expensive, hoping that the asset would get even more expensive, or I could find like a greater fool. And I just kind of got sucked up.
That's sort of like the way the stock market works today, though. That's it makes it challenging for you with that experience, doesn't it?
Well, it's definitely the way the stock market works, or the way it's working. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I see. And now I preach till I'm blue in the face that you've got to buy things when they're cheap and sell them when they're expensive. And I've done that quite consistently.
True value investor.
What's ironic is I did that in 2012 without even knowing it. Back then, I really didn't have a framework. It's just I wanted to do what Jim Rogers did, and I knew that Jim Rogers bought stuff when no one wanted it and when it was cheap. So I did it in 2012, but I didn't really make it a rule.
Yeah.
And after I made the mistake in Ecuador, I made that a rule of investing for myself. And since that time, I've made a lot of money in real estate, in other areas, by keeping that mentality that you got to buy things when they're cheap. And if you're considering purchasing an asset and all of your buddies and all your family members are telling you that you're absolutely insane, like, George, what are you doing? Are you out of your mind? It's almost like an AA intervention, right? Where you're an alcoholic and your whole family waits for you at the house till you come in, and then they're like, "You really need therapy. We're going to stop you from being your own worst enemy." And it was, if your friends aren't doing that when you're looking at a long-term investment, you might want to think twice. But if you tell all your friends and family members what you're considering, and they're like, "Oh my God, yeah. Oh, that's a fantastic idea. You know what? I was just thinking about doing that myself. And I was talking to my wife about doing it. Yeah, we're gung ho. In fact, we can do this together." And as a matter of fact, all my buddies down at the police station or wherever you work, at the office, they're thinking about doing XYZ. That's when you need to take a pause and time out, say, wait a minute here. Am I on the wrong side of the boat? And that's what I really try to preach now on the YouTube channel and to everyone. But it's so difficult for people, Patrick, because they get hyper fixated on the direction of the price of XYZ, or what direction is the market going. And if they could just get that out of their head and just forget about it and only focus on the value proposition, they would do so much better. And I forgot to tell the story, but when I was struggling in business, when I first started, before I had some winners, I learned to play blackjack. I think this is a conversation that you and I have had. And by understanding how to play blackjack well, I understood not only the power of probabilities, but I also understood that if you just release the outcome from your mind. So, and when I'm saying that what's going to happen in this hand, if you win or lose the hand, that doesn't matter. If you can get rid of that, just cut ties with that being your focal point and just focus on playing each hand well based on the probabilities, and forget whether you lose the hand or win the hand. Forget whether you're making money or losing money. Just focus on playing well. If you do that in the long run, you're always going to come out ahead. So I think
that is,
from
your lips to God's ears, like that, like in trading in general, that's the way it works, which is a really good trader has a process from which they invest and trade. And it should never be about the trade you're in, but rather the process from which you choose to trade. And so true words of wisdom coming from you, obviously from a blackjack perspective, but it is so applicable. It's just the way it all comes together, right?
Yeah, and on my Twitter feed and in the comments of my YouTube channel, I always see people saying, well, if you wouldn't have been in the market over the last and we've all heard this, right?
Yeah.
If you wouldn't have been in Tesla over the last year or whatever, 6 months, you would have lost out on all these gains. They always say that. Or if you would have sold XYZ stock, then you wouldn't have realized all these gains. Or if you would have sat out the market over the last 5 years, you wouldn't have realized all these gains. And you just hear that constantly. People need to divorce themselves from that mentality, because that's the same thing as sitting at the blackjack table and you're there with your buddy. And your buddy, let's say, it has a 19. And you're telling him, listen, dude, you want to stay on that you got a 19. There's a very low probability that if you hit, you actually win. Like just stay on a 19. Trust me. And he says, oh, you're just too conservative. You don't know what you're talking about. I've got a Fed put on this hand, and the Fed's going to bail me out, and you're crazy. So he goes ahead and hits, right? And then he gets a 2 and gets blackjack. Well, who was right and who was wrong? Of course, your buddy is going to look at you and say, see, I told you, I told you if I wouldn't have hit on this 2, then I wouldn't have got a blackjack. I would have missed out on all those gains. But from your standpoint, you're like, listen, go ahead and keep doing that over the next 10 years in the casino
and see how that works.
See what's going to happen. See if that, see how that's working out for you. And it's the exact same way in the markets. If you sit there and try to get fixated on what you would have made, or if the market is going up, or if the market is going down, you're just gonna you're gonna come out on the downside there, or you're gonna lose money, in my opinion. But if you just forget about all that stuff, it's fun to talk about. I love doing videos about it and just thinking it through. And intellectually, it's very fascinating. But from an investment standpoint, and again, this isn't about trading. This is just, if you're a long-term investor, just get that out of your head. Focus on the basics. Focus on the fundamentals, on value, buying things when they're cheap. And also, too, I want to clarify that when I'm saying buying things when they're cheap, from my standpoint, I don't even look at something that could be considered cheap because in the future, they're going to be making a lot of money. So again, let's go back to Tesla. Someone could argue that was a Tesla bull, that Tesla is cheap right now because in 10 years, they're going to be doing this, and that. And based on all of this stuff that's going to happen in the future, well, their share price is cheap. See, I don't do that. And again, this goes back to business. When I was in the world of buying and selling businesses, and I'm not talking about big, huge corporations. I'm just talking about gas stations and, businesses for under $2 million. Yeah. You would never, ever, ever pay for, let's say you've got a seller, right? You're going back and forth with the business broker, and the seller is sitting there telling you about how great their business is going to be. And they have all these pro forma financials and P&Ls and income statements. And you're just like, I don't care. Like, I'm not paying for what your business is going to be. I'm paying for what your business is right now. So if your P&L is this, okay, well, that's what I'm paying you for on your profit right now. And I'll pay you a multiple on that, but not on a multiple on some crazy numbers that may or may not happen in the future. And I think I got into that mindset so much by analyzing and getting in that world of buying and selling these small businesses that I was able to train my brain. So it's very easy for me to segue into seeing things the same way with investments. I did a whiteboard video the other day where I was trying to convey this message to my audience. And I was saying, think about buying a McDonald's, right? If you're going in there buying a McDonald's, are you really concerned with what the price of the McDonald's is going to be if you could sell it in the next week or the next 2 months? No, you're not. That's not even, you're not even considering that. The only thing you're doing is you're looking at the P&L and you're saying, okay, great. I got to take on XYZ amount of debt to buy this thing. So my servicing the debt is going to cost me this much. Okay. They're netting this much. Okay. That means I'm going to put this much in my pocket. For how much I've got to take out of my pocket to buy the business in the first place. Is that a good return? Yes or no? And then if the answer is yes, then what I would used to try to do is I'd try to buy $1 for 50 cents. And that's what I still try to do today with investing in the markets or whatever I'm doing. So if let's say their ask price is $1 million, well, I'm going to try to get that thing at 750, and I'm going to do whatever I can to get that. And that, that you play a lot of games with that in the due diligence process. We won't get into that. Yeah. I won't share all my secrets. But now, what I do is you can't do the same thing, obviously, because it's not like if Apple shares are trading at 200, it's not like you can somehow get them at 150. But what I'll do is I'll try to look for these opportunities in the market where that dollar is trading at 50 cents. And just because of, who knows, like as an example with Volkswagen, let's say, remember when they had that big thing where they tried to pull the wool over the eyes of the regulators with their diesel engine, something like that, a big, huge PR thing. So their share price, if it was cheap then, that's something that I might consider. Or going back to March as an example, Patrick, when oil was really crashing and everything was crashing back then, I went in and I remember listening to a podcast with Eric saying, and he was talking about he thinks the price of oil could go down to like 10. And it was right around 20. I think might have been before it went to negative 40.
Right.
And I was listening to Eric. I was listening to everyone on Macro Voices and Art Berman. I was trying to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. I said, yeah, I kind of see how it could go down below 20. But then I said, listen, the bottom line is it could go to 20 or it could go to 10, it could go to 5. But the fact of the matter is anytime it gets below 30, if you look at a historic chart adjusted for inflation, it's cheap. It's cheap. Right. And I may think the market may go down further, but that's not going to make me pull the trigger if I'm staying true to my investment framework. So although I thought oil most likely would continue to go down, I still went in and bought. And I bought the producer, I bought Shell and a couple others, but I went in and bought there. So that's a great example of me totally ignoring what I thought the price would do and just buying it just because it's cheap and letting the chips fall where they may. And that's another example of when I'm trying to look at buying $1 for 50 cents. What most people do is they try to buy $1 for $3, hoping that it goes to $5.
Buy high to sell higher, for sure. Like that's the, but there's an entire school of investing that is focused on that methodology, and everyone has their own way of engaging the market, but you truly have that value investor approach to your methodology. Listen, George, I actually want to talk to you about a bunch of your episodes and things like that you had. Well, first of all, why don't we start with this? Now, you gave us a great history of what you're all about, but you started the Rebel Capitalist show at georgegammon.com. And first of all, why don't you give us a quick summary of why you started it and what's it all about and what is it that you're trying to accomplish with it, and then we'll jump into talking about the Fed and the QE and all sorts of other really cool things. So why don't you give us a quick summary?
Yeah, sure. Well, I started doing real estate in Colombia, and that's kind of an extension of the past story. In 2019, and I started doing that in 2015. In 2019, I had a whole team here. We were doing flips. We were doing the exact same stuff that you see on all those reality shows in the United States, like Flip or Flop or Fixer Upper. And I thought to myself, well, man, I mean, we're doing this anyway. Why not just turn it into a TV show? And then I'll just figure out how to monetize a TV show later. It was just that typical entrepreneurial mindset, just shoot first and ask questions later. And I had no clue how to produce a TV show, of course. I just thought it'd be a good idea. So I just pitched the local station here in Medellin. The station's called Telemedellin. And they're like, long story short, they said, yeah, it's a good idea. If you want to produce it, we'll put it on air, and then we'll split the commercials and the profits and stuff. And I said, yeah, let's do it. And of course, I was telling them, oh, yeah, this show is going to be awesome. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be great. And then when they say yes, I was walking out with my assistant and with the couple people that were working for me. And I'm like, okay, well, now we got to figure out how to produce a TV show. And we had about 2 weeks, but we just, it was just, anyway, a lot of fun. Did the TV show. That was a big success. Everyone loved it. I had some great editors, great camera people. We got done to the first season. I didn't really like dealing with the network too much. And we were kind of in that time frame between the first and the second season. So that's when I started the YouTube channel. And initially the YouTube channel, I was just going to make it about real estate investing because that's what I knew. And but going back to 2012, although I had been investing mostly in real estate, my passion was macro and just talking about investing. And I mean, I was just a diehard, as you know, fan of Macro Voices and helping you guys out with Macro Voices Live. And that's what I was really passionate about. And so that's what I was always listening to the podcast. And whenever I was in a conversation with someone, I would never really like talking about real estate. I mean, you talk about it here and there, it's okay. But I wanted to talk about the Fed. I wanted to talk about quantitative easing and all these things. So we did maybe 20, 30 videos. And then I'm like, listen, this is happening with like the repo market or something like that. I'm like, I got to do a video on this. I know it's probably going to flop, but I got to talk about this. So I did a video on macro, and I forgot the specific topic, but of course that video took off. Right. And I'm like, wow, this is cool. Great. So I did a couple more, and those videos were wildly popular, where the real estate videos weren't popular at all. And so then I started in the whiteboard, and everyone loved that. So I just kept doing it, and it was a great fit because it just happened to be what people wanted to hear and what the YouTube algorithm liked. And it's what I like talking about. So that was the genesis, and why I keep doing it is because I would be talking about this anyway. So why not just kind of film myself doing it? And I absolutely love talking to people like you and Eric and Jeff Snyder and Luke Groman and Brent Johnson and Juliet DeClerc and Art Berman and Rick Rule, Doug Casey, Peter Schiff. I mean, the other day I interviewed Robert Kiyosaki, for heaven's sakes. Wow. And this is, my YouTube channel's only been up for like 9 months, 10 months, under a year. So it's just been an amazing journey. And it's just every single day, it's awesome because you can wake up and you're excited about what you're going to do. And now I'm doing some other things, and I've actually set up a second YouTube channel that it's actually live, but none of the videos are up because we're building like a 70 video library. And that's going to be more about vlogs and real estate investing and personal liberty, freedom, getting a second passport, offshore bank account, stuff like that. So that was kind of how we got to where we are today.
Nice. So you've been releasing a whole wave of these videos. So why don't we get into some markets and talk about some macro here? Because you have some pretty strong opinions on what's going on at the Fed with the QE and the Fed bailouts and how this is impacting bank reserves and other stuff. So why don't you kind of talk us through in some of your most recent videos, like what you were talking about, and what's your general view on how this is all shaping up?
Well, if we're going to start talking about the Fed, I hope you got a beer.
I got a beer. I actually almost finished this one. I'm going to have to go get another one, clearly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. You want to get out the beer bong when we start talking about the Fed. Or you got to get out the shots or something like that. On my videos, I always say it's stiff drink time. And so it's stiff drink time right now, or another beer time for Patrick. So going into the Fed, some of my more recent videos, I think something that's really interesting right now is the TGA. And I don't know if you guys have been talking about this on Macro Voices, or maybe Lynn talked about this. So I apologize if this is redundant, but I think it's just how this is going to play out between now and the election. I think however it plays out, there's going to be fireworks. And one thing, going back 6 months, we had this back and forth with Trump and Powell, where Trump, he's always critical and just ripping him on Twitter and kind of being a jerk and trying to push him one way and saying he's an idiot and all these things. You got to think that Powell, although he keeps his composure for obvious reasons, when he's reading those tweets, he's probably getting pissed. I mean, you could see the smoke coming out of his ears, and he's like, this SOB, blah, 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 blah. And if you look at a chart of the TGA, and there's the Treasury General Account, going back prior to 2008, you see that it would fluctuate between like $2 and $5 billion, billion with a B. What happened in 2008, just to give it some context, is the TGA went from the commercial banking system, and the Fed went to the Treasury, said, hey, listen, guys, if you could do us a huge favor and bring your bank account into the Fed, that would help us out a lot, because then we'd have better control over the amount of bank reserves in the system. And back then, remember, they were probably very worried about inflation. I think this might have been before they set up IOR or IOER. So they're thinking, okay, we're going to flood the system with bank reserves. How on earth to buy these treasuries to keep the long end of the curve down? How are we going to get interest rates above zero? And so they said, listen, Treasury, bring the TGA into the Fed. So what happens is if there's any dollars going into the TGA, those are bank reserves that are coming out of the banking system, is how that works. But if the TGA spends money into the economy, then that means there's more bank reserves in the system. And if you're kind of scratching your head right now saying to yourself, okay, well, that sounds a lot like quantitative easing, you're right. It is. It's almost the exact same thing as quantitative easing. But when the TGA does it, they're not just creating additional bank reserves, they're also creating additional bank deposits in the real economy. And this is what's so fascinating, because when the Fed does QE, they're just printing up bank reserves. It's like an asset swap, like Snyder always says. They're just printing up bank reserves, and they're giving that to XYZ primary dealer for a mortgage-backed security, for a treasury, whatever. So, but it doesn't really change anything other than there's just more bank reserves under the Fed's mattress, if you will. That's how I always look at it in my videos. I call it the Fed bed. It's like putting $1 trillion under your mattress. If it doesn't get out into circulation, it doesn't do anything. It's just
it can't be inflationary when it's
static, right? It's not going to create price inflation in the real economy, because generally what does that is the commercial banking system, at least the majority of it. But with the TGA, with the Treasury spending money into the economy, that's creating more bank deposits, therefore directly increasing M2 money supply. Where if the Fed does the bank reserves, then although you do see a correlation there, the banking system has to take action. They have to do something in order to increase M2 money supply in the broad economy to get that, hopefully, hopefully if you're the Fed, to get their target inflation rate. So that's the big difference. So now the Treasury went from 2 to 5 billion in their account. When Trump came into office, they bumped that up to like 200 to 400 billion. So if you think this through, if the Treasury has 400 billion in their account and they spend that into the economy, just boom, let's say in 1 month, that is quantitative easing like we have never seen it before. Well, maybe prior to the virus, like we'd never seen it before. You go back to QE3. QE3 was, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was like 80 billion a month. So they could drop 400 billion, boom, just like that. Think what that would do to the stock market or to the expansion of the balance sheet capacity for the primary dealer banks, and then what they could lend the hedge funds and the financial institutions. So if you look at the TGA now, it's up to 1.6 trillion with a T.
Yeah.
And I think what happened, or what could have happened, and I'll put on my tinfoil hat here and I'll admit that no problem. But if you go back to the repo spike, I think that could have been the Treasury or the administration, whoever is calling the shots there. They're pulling money out of the bank reserves or out of the system. So there's fewer bank reserves to force the Fed to come in and supply the reserves or to supply the liquidity that is needed for the system. Right? Because back then, Trump and Powell were going back and forth. You shouldn't do quantitative tightening. You should be lowering interest rates. There should be more liquidity, blah, blah, blah. So that could have been the Treasury like playing a game of chicken with the Fed. So the repo spike, Fed comes in. They say, okay, fine, you win. We'll come in with all of this liquidity. Then you have the virus come in. So the Fed has to come, or in their eyes, they have to come to the rescue. So if you're the Treasury, you can just sit back and not spend a dime and just let the taxes and all these the treasury auctions, of course you spend a little bit of money, but you can just let your account grow and grow and grow. So you're sucking more and more bank reserves out of the system, and it's not really going to matter because the Fed is creating so many bank reserves by taking their balance sheet from under 4 trillion up to 7 trillion. So now you have this war chest, as Luke Gromen calls it, where you can spend that into the economy prior to the election to try to win the election by basically giving a sugar rush to the economy and potentially the stock market. And where it gets super interesting is how does the Treasury deliver this? Well, most likely through another round of stimulus checks. Well, what did people do with the last round of stimulus and their additional unemployment? A lot of them set up these Robinhood accounts and started buying Nikola, or they started buying Hertz after they had filed bankruptcy. So think about what happens if they've got 1.6 trillion that they need to, or well, not that they need to, but if they think that they need to spend this to win the election. And by the way, Trump is way behind in the polls. I don't really follow it too much, but just from what I've heard, Trump is way behind Biden. So
but he was also behind Hillary too, right? So
yeah, there you go. There you go. He could just be kind of playing his hand, and he's got this ace up his sleeve. So 2 months or a month or who knows prior to the election, they just start raining down helicopter money. So that's going into the economy. Everybody's getting these stimulus checks saying, oh my gosh, well, all my friends hate Trump and I would never admit voting for him. But man, I mean, I'm getting $1,000 a month. My purchasing power has improved dramatically and I'm on unemployment. Man, maybe I should vote for this guy again. And then, of course, that's creating additional bank reserves at the same time, just like the Fed doing quantitative easing, expanding the balance sheet capacity of the primary dealer banks, and potentially making the stock market continuing or keeping it going up, while at the same time those people are taking the additional M2 money supply and dumping it right into their Robinhood account to buy more and more shares. So you can envision this
George,
thing. Yeah, I'm sorry.
What's your intuition on this? Like, do you think that this can just keep going up until the elections? Like, do you think that this there's going to be that this rally is not going to be checked and that they can keep this thing going?
I think they can. Of course, it's about probabilities, and I don't know if I'd give it a 10%, if I'd give it a 20%, I'm not sure, but it's definitely possible. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, they're spending 1.6 trillion into the economy. And I know I talked to Lynn about this the other day, and she said they came out with a statement saying that their goal at a certain period of time, I think it was after the election, was to have at least 800 billion in the account. But I mean, you know how they are. They can say anything in between now and then. I mean, who knows what they do? They just pretty much, they've abandoned all the rules. I mean, look at what the Fed's done with the Federal Reserve Act. I mean, are you kidding me? They're just making a mockery of it. They're just completely ignoring it with these special purpose vehicles and all of these things. You know, one Macro Voices episode that I really, really love. I mean, I love all of them, but one that really sticks in my mind is the last interview that Eric did with Dr. Lacey Hunt. And, you know, Eric, Eric did such a brilliant job in this interview. And I know how hard that is because I do interviews myself where I'm interviewing all these people, and it's not as easy as it looks. But Eric, you know, he just subtly kept trying to push Dr. Hunt, saying, okay, well, I understand what you're saying, but because Dr. Hunt's thing was based on the Federal Reserve Act, the way it is now, the Fed can't really spend money directly into the economy. So Dr. Hunt defined that as money printing. You and I would probably define money printing as just creating bank reserves, but I don't think that's how Dr. Hunt defined it. He defined it as the Fed actually spending money directly into the economy like the Treasury does. And that was kind of the tipping point for him, where if he was a deflationist up until that point, but if the Fed crossed that Rubicon, he went from being a deflationist to like a hyperinflationist. Like there's no passing go. You just go from 0 to 10 right there. We're not. Yeah. He passes the 1970s. all of that. You just go from one to the other. And so his point was that the way the rule is right now, the Fed can't do that. And Eric kept pushing him, saying, look at what the Fed's been doing. They've been totally ignoring the Federal Reserve Act, and at least the spirit of it for sure. And so that was Eric's point, that I don't know that the Federal Reserve Act is going to prevent them from doing that. And I completely agree with Eric. I think the Fed and the government, they just do whatever they want now. I mean, they ignore the
Well, I mean, what you want to think
is,
is, well, George, I was going to say, like, what ends up happening is that it's like who is going to object to them breaking the rules, right? So, like, there might be a law and it says that this is the way it's written, but if it's in the benefit of the government and it's in the benefit of the Fed, and if most people will benefit from the fact that their assets are stable in this environment, who's the one who's going to object that they're breaking the rules?
Yeah, exactly. So, and going back to our original point there, I put out a tweet yesterday or something like that. I said the future headline could be Dow at 50,000 while unemployment is at 50%. And it's kind of
that's your tin hat right there. You've got the tin hat going.
Yeah. But you could see it because you know what? It was in response, Patrick, to a headline that I saw on Bloomberg or something like that, saying that last quarter was the best quarter in the stock market since 1987.
Well,
and so that's kind of why I tweeted that.
Conveniently, the bottom came right at the end of the first quarter. And so you're measuring from the exact lowest point to the next highest point, right? And so it's convenient from a perspective, because if the market bottomed in February, and it would have been a whole different scenario. But anyway.
Yeah, but think about that. If we have a second wave here, or a first wave in a lot of, and I apologize for the international viewers, I'm being U.S. centric. But if we have a second wave or a first wave in a lot of these states, like we're seeing in Florida, Arizona, et cetera, you could imagine if it gets, obviously I'm not hoping this, but it gets so bad that unemployment, I mean, it popped up to 20? And as well as I do, the way they measure unemployment is totally bogus. It's just as bad, if not worse, than the CPI.
Political fiction.
Yeah, if you measured the unemployment rate the way they used to, it would be up, or at least the way they did in the Depression, it would be at least at those levels. Do you know, I did a video on this the other day that I got a big kick out of it. The way that they measured inflation back in the 1930s, or the way they retroactively measured it, they excluded a lot of government jobs because they felt as though they weren't even productive. So if you had a government job, you were considered unemployed. And I thought, wow, they really hit the nail on the head. I wish we were as smart today as they were back then. But my point is, if you measure inflation correctly, if we get a second wave, you could see unemployment maybe not getting to 50, but darn close. And then you combine that with this 1.6 trillion in the TGA, and if they unload that in 2 weeks or a month, I don't know. I mean, maybe not 50,000 and 50%, but maybe, I don't know, 35 and 35. It's a fun thought experiment.
Well, it'll be entertaining to watch to see how it plays out. But let's move on, because you did a little video on the swap lines. Why don't you talk us through what you were trying to explain?
I was trying to think through how the liquidity could get to where it needs to go. So if we think of this from a dollar milkshake theory standpoint, Brent Johnson, we've all heard this, and it's an incredible theory, and it's very well thought out. It's basically, there's so much dollar-denominated debt outside of the United States, and the euro-dollar system is breaking down. Snyder talks about this going all the way back to 2008. So there's not enough dollars for the amount of debt, and if you create more debt, to Brent's point, you're just creating more demand for dollars. So how do you get out of this vicious cycle? So everyone says, well, Brent, don't worry about it. The Fed set up these swap lines so these corporations can get as much liquidity as they need. Not really. because if you actually dig a little deeper and understand how the swap lines work, it's a lot more complex. And so what happens when the Fed sets up a swap line, let's say with the BOJ, the Fed will just create additional bank reserve. The BOJ has an account with the Fed. They create bank reserves, dollar denominated, and then the BOJ does the same thing for the Fed in yen. And if there is let's call it XYZ Japanese Corp, if they're needing dollars because they're just drowning in their dollar denominated debt, they don't have any dollars coming in because global trade has come to a standstill because of the virus, for whatever reason, then they would most likely have to go to a commercial bank. The commercial bank goes to the BOJ, and then the BOJ says, okay, fine, you can access the swap line. They access the swap line through an intermediary bank that goes to the Fed. That's where they get the money to back up the newly created dollar loans that they would give to XYZ Corp. So a lot of people say, well, why don't they, if the euro dollar system, if they just create dollars out of thin air, why don't they do it? Because they don't have the balance sheet capacity is just the short answer there. But still, it goes back to the problem that the Fed has right now in getting money into the real economy, to where they're reliant on the commercial banking system. Right. So think about this. If you're a bank in Japan and you're looking at this XYZ Corp that doesn't have the cash flow really coming in to satisfy the dollar denominated debt, are you really going to give them a loan? Because it's not a liquidity issue, it's a solvency issue. And it goes, and just because you give them the loan, well, fine. But now they've got even more debt than they had before, but they don't have any more dollars coming in. And you could say, well, maybe global trade goes back to where it was before. Well, fine, but they still had a problem. And then you have to weigh the probabilities of global trade going back once we get this virus in the rearview mirror, you've got all these people politically and in society pushing for things like deglobalization. So if you have all these supply chains coming back to the United States, well, there's going to be fewer and fewer dollars getting outside of the United States. So this Japanese corp is going to be in the exact same spot in a month, in a year, whatever. So the bank is going to look at that. They're going to lose money and we're on the hook. And then you say, well, the central bank could come in and bail out the corporations just like the Fed did in the United States. But that doesn't really work either, because if you look at the statement by the Fed, the BOJ in this case would be on the hook for the dollars. So if XYZ Corp goes bust, the BOJ is still on the hook. Yeah. And so does the BOJ really want to provide that when they're holding the bag? Most likely not. So you see this daisy chain of events that would have to happen in order for the entities outside of the United States to actually get the dollars that are being provided by this swap line. And it's like, that's not going to happen. Like that's never, ever going to happen. It's almost like the Fed would need to directly bail out that individual Japanese corporation. And how they would do that, I don't know. But maybe that's why they're going in now and buying all of these bonds of corporations that aren't even American. And I understand they've got factories and they've got facilities in the United States, but I don't know, is that a indirect way to bail out these foreign corporations because the swap lines aren't working? I don't know, probably good
thought process.
Yeah, it's probably an interesting topic for another whiteboard video.
Well, for sure. Well, you know what? Listen, I mean, we could probably talk for 2-3 hours, but the reason we don't have to is because you have your own channel and you talk about these things. Like how many times a week do you release a video?
I usually do 3 interviews for the Rebel Capitalist show where I interview people like you and all the guys on Macro Voices. And then I do 2 whiteboard videos per week, sometimes 3, usually 2.
So anyone who wants more of George, we'll have him tell you where to find him in a moment. But I want to leave with 2 questions here, and because, I mean, when people hear you talk and they hear you, many people make a lot of assumptions. But what is something people seem to misunderstand about you? Is there something that you feel that you want to explain to people?
The first thing I'd like them to understand is I'm not that smart, and that I'm no smarter than anyone else. Average intelligence at best. And the reason I want people to understand that is because if I can get this stuff, you can too. And we are heading into times right now that are unknown, to say the least. And you can either be prepared or you can be a victim. And I would prefer people be prepared. And in order to do that, so you can set yourself up now for the future. And when I say set yourself up, I'm talking about your finances, your portfolio. You've got to understand this stuff. You've got to understand macro. You've got to understand how the Fed works. And I think people get intimidated by it because they just don't understand the esoteric language. Because we talk about all these things that it's like any business, really. It's got its own language. And if you don't understand the language, then you think as though you could never comprehend what's actually being said. But that's not true. So just, I don't know, if it's my channel or Macro Voices or Real Vision, just try to power through, or follow these guys on Twitter as well. They're very, very active. And try to understand as much as you can, realizing that if you don't understand it now, it's just due to a lack of understanding of the terminology. It's not because you don't have the brain power to comprehend it. And I'm a perfect example of that. If I can get it, trust me, you can get it.
All right. Well, George, we always like to leave with the one question. And I ask you a simple thing, that if you could go back in time and give advice to the young George that is just graduating college, and gives them a little bit of advice on what would you tell that young George?
Number one, I'd say the online business model is far superior than the brick and mortar. So when you're an entrepreneur, consider making some investments in your own personal business into marketing online. It's just a no-brainer. And I also, of course, would have told myself to buy things when they're cheap. So I wouldn't have made that mistake in Ecuador. And then I would also tell myself, as soon as you start making a little bit of money, try to figure out a way through your investments where you can buy investments that pay you enough to handle your monthly bills, and do that as quickly as you possibly can. So as an example, when I was an entrepreneur, my monthly net would be, call it 10, 20 grand, something like that. I was never, ever thinking about, well, how can I take all this money I'm making and invest it into dividend paying stocks or real estate? So every month from my investments, I can have this $20,000 coming in to where I'm not having to deplete any of the money that I'm making from the business or any of the cash flow or any of my savings. And I never really thought about it. I just was hyper focused on making sure the business grew and grew and grew, and more money, more money, more money. But if I would have focused on that in addition to what I was doing, I think it would have served me well. And I didn't start thinking that way until 2012. And I think how that may be applicable to other people or younger people, if go out there and house hack if you can. Or just take the concept of house hacking and apply that to whatever you can. So house hacking is when you go out there, you buy a triplex, and you have the other two, your renters are paying the mortgage. So then you can take all that money that you would have spent on rent. Basically, they're paying your bills for you. You got your investment is covering your monthly nut from the standpoint of your housing cost. Then you can take that housing cost, or what you would have spent on rent or mortgage, and then you can start investing it. You can start saving it. You can start building up 10, 20 grand so you can start your own online business, or maybe start an investment portfolio, or start trading, doing all these things. And that's so that's the mindset that I would have encouraged my younger self to get in ASAP.
There you go. Well, that's great advice. So, George, for all of our listeners that want to learn more about you and follow you, where can they find you? Give them your details.
Sure. You can just find me on Twitter, George Gammon. Last name is Gammon. First name is typical spelling of George. It's not Jorge, although a lot of my buddies call me that. And the website is georgegammon.com, or the YouTube channel is just George Gammon.
All right. Well, George, I can't thank you enough for a great interview, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Oh, likewise. Thanks for having me, Patrick.
All right. Cheers.
Harris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
It's going to be a good one. It's just you and me today, so Patrick doesn't join us, so we're going to talk about all sorts of things that are nice, like inflation and maybe even the euro going up without him harking back on us. So let's jump into it in terms of the markets. Crazy times, lots of kooky stuff happening with Dave Portnoy jumping into it, and there's all sorts of strange moves in stocks that we have never seen before. It harkens back to a time in the late 90s, don't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, I've never seen so many $1 stocks becoming $5 stocks, becoming $1 stocks all in a week. On like millions and millions of shares. Like some of these things would trade, 20, 30,000 shares a day, and they'll trade 100 million shares for the whole week. And there's no news. There's no fundamental reason why anything should have changed.
Well, except there is news. A lot of times it's in the Reddit boards and or it's on Dave Portnoy. It's stuff that you and I as old guys aren't looking into.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have this Bloomberg thing, which used to be, where news came from. And I'd plug in some ticker symbol, and all they say is like delinquent on filings. And, and then you have to go on to Twitter and you find out whatever crazy story they've made up about the company.
That's right. You got to replace your Bloomberg with a Reddit subscription.
It seems that way.
So which ones, like, why don't you talk about like your known du jour, which is like Polar Power, right? Like that's the one you're looking at today.
Yeah. So look, I've owned Polar Power for over a year, probably 2 years now. And, I've averaged down. When it got, to $2, I bought a bunch. I got to $1.75, I bought a bunch. When I got to $1.25, I bought a bunch. I mean, I ended up owning a few percent of this company. And, look, it's a great company. I really like the people running it. But COVID's hurt them bad. They make power systems for telecoms. And no one's doing CapEx right now with COVID. Everyone's, pulling back on their budgets. And Polar, I mean, they missed badly on revenue in Q4. They missed badly on revenue in Q1. They put out their 10Q yesterday. They didn't even bother with a press release. The news isn't good. The news is actually quite terrible, which is unfortunate because I actually really like this company. But yesterday, it started trading a lot of volume. I mean, look, there's 3 million shares in the float of this thing, and like I own 10% of the floats. And so it traded like 800, 900,000 shares yesterday. I'm thinking to myself, that's really weird. Like, I mean, 50,000 shares used to be a big day for these guys. And then today it's traded 59 million shares so far. The stock's up $1.50. I mean, look, they took 300,000 of my shares and they didn't even blink.
Let's have a look here. Do you know why it's going up, or is this still a mystery?
I don't even know. I woke up and the stock had doubled, and I said, "Good, that's been a good day for Kuppy." And I put in like a 300,000 share iceberg, and they just ran through it. Like, I mean, look, I sold, what is it, like 100 days of volume in like 4 minutes. Like, I don't get it.
I don't get it. I don't get it either. Like, how is this thing trading 60 million shares? Like,
I mean, there's 3 million shares in the float. Yeah. And I mean, look, management owns 65% of it. It's a good company, okay? If not for COVID, it'd probably be like a $4 or $5 stock because they're executing on. They were executing what they said they'd do. Actually, met with them in Los Angeles in December. I was really impressed. But this COVID has been terrible for them. But no one seems to care. I don't know. I mean, look, it's up 20 cents from where I sold it.
It just keeps going.
It just keeps going.
I don't understand how you could trade like 20 times the float and 30 times the actual total shares outstanding. And it doesn't seem to be stopping at all.
No, I mean, look, I had a couple friends of mine that each had 6-figure positions as well. I would say that between myself and 5 friends, we probably had half the float. And I mean, we're all out. It literally just ran through us.
And we've seen this happen before. You know, I guess it was about a month ago or maybe a little longer than that. You started to bring it to my attention these kind of Class A shares or the voting share situations where all of a sudden you'd have the voting share that, you know, on a $4 stock that would go from 4 to like 50 in a day, and we could never figure out what was going on, you know, and I still don't know what's going on.
Those spreads haven't collapsed. I don't get it because, I mean, look, if the founder owns 70 or 80% of the voting shares, I mean, the voting shares really should just trade in line with the non-voting because, I mean, you're not going to outvote the founder, so what's the point? And I honestly think they were added to ETFs or something that are forced to buy these things, and the ARBs all got ran over trying to close the ARB. And I mean, there's just weird stuff going on, but I mean, like, I go to my percent gainers list, and it used to be, you know, companies I'd heard of that had good news, biotech thing, the drug works. Now it's just like China fraud, stock promote, something weird. And they used to, I mean, the $1 stocks would go to like $3. Now they go to like $9, and they trade 1 billion shares. I don't get it. The Dave Portnoy, I mean, look, I'm actually kind of happy because, I mean, for a very long time, you and I used to complain that it's hard to trade against machines. I mean,
right.
He's brought a bunch of new shooters to the table, and it's great.
What's funny about him, I was watching him this morning, and he said something to the effect that all my, you know, real stocks are getting crushed, and it's all my crappy stocks that are going up. Well, this shows me I shouldn't listen to the suits. I should just buy the crap. Right. And it's amazing when even he is perplexed at the fact that all this crappy stuff goes up. Now, do you think this is just a function of too much liquidity in the system?
I don't know what it's a function of. I think it's literally a function of people who just want to gamble. I mean, we haven't even talked about Hertz. I mean, we're talking about like Polar Power trading, you know, 60 million shares in the day. But what about Hertz? I mean, it traded hundreds of millions of shares, and it went up from, what, 60 cents to $8. Like,
right.
That's a whole different world.
Right, because that takes a lot more in terms of the actual market cap to move. But
it's fundamentally bankrupt. At least Polar Power, you could say that it's probably worth more than it's trading for today, if not for COVID, and it probably will be worth more in the future because I think the guys running it are actually good entrepreneurs. They just had to run a bad luck. I mean, Hertz is bankrupt. It's like, end of story, all stop here, fundamentally bankrupt.
And it's just a greater fool of the kind of Robin Hooders jumping in there and then thinking that they're going to sell it to the next Robin Hooder.
That's what it has to be, because I don't think people on Robinhood even, I mean, look, there's some stuff that people pass around on Twitter, and they're saying, you know, guys on Robinhood asking if you can unbankrupt a company, or, you know, like, you know, there's people who genuinely think they're actually investing, but I think most people just think they're gambling, and, you know, they're going to buy it at one price and sell it at another price. But who knows? I don't get it.
Well, one of the things that you've stumbled upon is the fact that with all these crazy moves, implied volatilities have gone through the roof. And
it's gone nutty.
Yeah. So you and I have been chatting because, like, Hertz, for example, what was it, north of 600?
Yeah.
I can't remember. Yeah,
I mean, the
it was something
vol
like
went
that.
crazy. Look, I sold some July 0.5 puts for 20 cents when vol went to 600 and the stock was at $3. I said, you know what? I'll take my chances. If I have to own Hertz at 0.3, like, I'll take my chances. And
right. And sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's just, but that's, you know, kind of like dumb fun and games. You do 100 lot of that. I'm talking about, you've seen a lot of stocks where the Robin Hooders go out there and they're buying their 2 lots, and they've just ripped call volatility, and it's pulled, the put volatility up because there's, you know, a parity there. And, you know, you understand this stuff better than me. But I've seen a lot of stocks that have historically been 30, 40 vol names, low risk, strong balance sheet, the sort of companies that just go nowhere. Where suddenly you can write the puts and get paid 150. And it just doesn't make sense that put volatility is 150 on a company that's trudging along and doing okay. You can go way out of the money and get paid 10% a month.
Right. And I think that also is a function of the COVID, to be truthful. And it was a function that so many people got hammered writing volatility the last time. So natural sellers of volatility are probably few and far between, right? All the pension funds that did it blew up. and there's only kind of shrewd guys like you selling it now.
Well, let's hope I'm shrewd. But I guess I take a different view of volatility. A lot of these pension funds, they were just doing something on OEX, or they're in SPY playing around. I'm actually writing puts on stuff I actually want to own, and I never write more puts than the cash on my balance sheet. So if everything got assigned to me tomorrow, I'd be very happy to own a lot of these companies 10, 15, 20% below today's price. And I'd collect my 10% premium. So, I'm going to get an extra 10% discount. But I'm very happy to own what I'm writing puts on. And I want to make a very clear point about that. I like to joke you could blow up on puts because so many people have blown up on puts. And, it's kind of like the crack cocaine of finance because you just write another 5 lot and write another 5 lot. And, your broker just lets you wave it on in. It's like a drug dealer, the drug dealer will help you overdose. And that's kind of how your broker is. They'll just help you overdose on puts.
Right.
Because
they give you a little taste to start with. Here's a little taste to start with.
Right. Because the way puts work is like right before you're about to get screwed on them, implied vol spikes even more, and suddenly get a margin call. So I just want to make sure that no one playing along at home is just going out there and be like, no, I'm going to do 1,000 lot of this and 2,000 lot of that. Make sure you want to actually own it.
Right. So if you don't use them in a levered manner, it's a much different strategy than going out and like writing, 30-day vol or like the pension plans were doing, which is what they were in essence doing, or swap variants or whatever they were doing that they thought they were so smart that they got killed on.
Didn't Niederhofer blow up like 7 times doing the same thing?
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of guys that do that. They just always go sell vol. Well, because traditionally, listen, the reason the pension plans do it is because traditionally it's overpriced. It often, and I kind of cut my eye teeth on an institutional equity desk, and it was an index desk, and we were always sellers because we had the bank's balance sheet and we were able to ride out the storms, and it was generally overpriced versus what it was. And then when it went against us, we were just able to sell more at a more overpriced thing. Now, I think that's changed in the last couple of years because what happened was in the past, when these things used to trade rich, it would be fellows on, institutional desk or prop shops selling it or true market makers. What I think happened was that all of a sudden the pension plans got in there and they saw they could find a way to actually create an income stream, and they started systematically selling it. And it almost created a self-fulfilling prophecy where the more they sold, the more all the market makers were long. So it actually reduced volatility until it didn't, and then they blew up. But back to this, I think it's a great strategy because a lot of people are stuck right now trying to figure out what they do in the market. They don't want to buy stuff because they look at it and they say, stock market's overpriced, I'm worried about COVID, but I got to put some money to work in some way. I can't buy bonds. The bonds are yielding nothing. What do I do? One of the ideas is exactly what you're doing. You go out, you take advantage of these high volatilities, pick stocks you like, and you sell the puts. And if the stock market collapses, you're going to own those names, but you wanted to own them anyways. Stock market goes sideways, then you've collected the premium. The only way you really lose is if the stock market takes off and you're basically only lost in opportunity cost because you should have been long stocks, but you weren't going to be long stocks in the first place.
Right. But even better than that is that, the market might take off, but if you're getting 10% per month writing puts, that's really good returns. Look, a good year is 20%. That's just 2 months. And this stuff just keeps compounding. And I don't know. I think volatility may stay structurally high for a long time for many of the reasons you talked about. Look, I don't know what's going to happen with COVID. I don't know what's going to happen with the election coming up in November. There's a funny kink in the volatility curve right now in November because everyone's pricing in November volatilities. But you have all these weird things happening. So, yeah, volatility should be a little higher, and VIX is higher. But whereas, VIX has been kicking around 30, a lot of these small cap names that I play in, they used to be 40 vol, they're 100 vol. And I think that's just like 50 vols too high, and I intend to harvest that for as long as I can. I'm talking with some of my friends, and we're talking about why would you ever be long something? Like take. We talked about my guns last time, so take like my Smith and Wesson, okay?
Okay.
I got into this really well, like the day before the riots. Big position. I sold out at 17.5. Okay. It started feeling a little rich to me, and when I sold it out at 17.5, I wrote the 16s for $2, which gets me back in at 14. So yeah, the stock's 21. I've missed out on some upside, but I would have missed that anyway because I said this is starting to get a little rich for me. Meanwhile, I could get back long at 14, which is 16 minus 2. Otherwise, I'm making $2 on 14 a risk. That's a mid-teens return. That's really, really good for 6 weeks.
And what, there's so many opportunities like this and names that you like. What are some of the others? Can you go through some of the other kind of names that you're selling puts
writing
on?
puts on? Well, I wrote some Ruger. I wrote some Visto brands, which is the bullet maker. I mean, I actually I kept my Ruger, but I sold my Visto brands as well when I got to 14, and I wrote 12 halves for $1.50. I mean, it gets me back long at 11, which is where I, basically doubled the position in the first place. So I have a.
Can you name something that's not a gun or a bullet manufacturer?
Yes, sure.
I know you Americans love your guns, but that's.
Okay, let's give you some other stuff. I'm long. I'm just trying to. I don't want to name something too liquid.
I got it. Well, let's get to the one that we were going to talk to you about. One of the things that both you and I like is this. It might be a hedge fund hotel, but I like it anyways. It's this P&G.
I wrote a lot of those. I wrote. I'm drowning in those.
Right. So this is the PG&E. This is the California utility company that's coming out of bankruptcy. So let's talk a little bit about this because it's an interesting play, and I think it's an actual legitimate stock that a lot of people aren't there. It's not on anyone's radar because, unfortunately, from the way I see it, it's owned by 5 to 10 hedge funds that own the majority of it. And what we're going to see now is it's going to add this after it's come out of bankruptcy. It's going to go through a process where it goes into real accounts' hands. And right now, nobody can own it apart from its hedge funds, really.
Right. I mean, just for some backstory for people who haven't been following, PC&G specializes in manslaughter and forest fires. They also have they also have a small utility division, which sells electricity. PC&G has now been bankrupt twice during my professional investing career, which it's pretty impressive. It's like Chuck E. Cheese. Every 10 years you expect it to go bankrupt. But PC&G they made a deal with a bunch of hedge funds who ended up buying all the equity, and it was structured so that they did a rights offering and an equity offering, and with a backstop. So all the hedge funds that owned this had all the incentive in the world to get this rights offering done at the cheapest price possible, the secondary offering and everything else. So everyone kind of walked the thing down in a rigged system where they priced it at 9.5 last week. But since everyone knew what was happening, no one would ever want to own this thing because you knew they were going to do 400 million share secondary offering. You knew it would trade a little soft just because that's a lot of shares. So why would you buy it at 12 or 13 or any price basically for the last 2 years? And so it's just kind of faded lower into this equity offering. And tomorrow it's going to be out of bankruptcy for the first time. So most institutional players can't own something in bankruptcy. So you have this brand new bid coming in tomorrow for the first time. These are equity longs that actually structurally want to own this thing, but their mandate didn't let them yesterday. Following that, it's going to get added to a bunch of ETFs and indexes. You have a bunch of structural buyers that basically couldn't buy previously and now can start buying July 1. And so I think this just sets up really well for a trade higher. But even with PC&G, do I really want to own a utility that's boring? It's sleepy. It's really not going. Maybe it goes to $12. Okay, $13. I don't know where in your head you think this goes, but would I rather do that, or would I rather write the AUG 9 puts for 90 cents and make 10%? I mean, of course, I'd rather do the AUG 9 puts because I either end up owning this at 8.10, where hell, I own some equity already and I'm kind of drowning in it, or I make my 10%. 10% is really good.
Right. And not only that, the thing's not paying a dividend right now. They're not able to in bankruptcy.
Right, right.
And if you just assume that there's going to be a bid under it as it changes hands from let's just say 10 really smart hedge funds to kind of the wider street, I suspect that it'll just grind higher is what I'm thinking it will, which is the perfect environment to sell puts on. It really is a great kind of setup.
I think you're right. I think it just slowly grinds higher, 20 cents a week for a very long time. I mean, it's a utility. It's not going anywhere fast. But it's perfect for selling puts. I've gone through the fundies on it. It's really cheap. It's like 10 times earnings where most of the other utilities are high teens. I mean, it should trade up to a higher valuation anyway. So it's low risk way to make some yield.
Right. And the other thing about this opportunity is that it's the vol, because it's in bankruptcy, is actually elevated, right? It's not trading It's not trading like a utility. It's trading twice as high as the index as a whole. Now that's an index, or 3 times as high almost as the index as a whole. But so obviously an index should trade lower, but it shouldn't probably be 65 or 70 like it is. So you could have a situation where you sell the puts and you actually win on all sorts of Vega collapse as well.
Oh, now you're getting too fancy for me.
Okay, so let's get on to the next thing, which is what I want to talk to you about is Florida. You know, you are, I saw that you guys are 20 million people roughly, or a little more than 20 million. You have 10,000 cases a week or a day. Sorry, is that right? Have I got the stats right?
Sounds about right.
Yeah. What's going on? How do you think it's going to affect the market? Is it going to get worse?
Well, I think everyone has to get this. I mean, one of the reasons I was able to buy the low, back in March was it became obvious that everyone has to catch this thing. We're going to go for herd immunity because there's no way you can quarantine the world. You'd have to shut your borders and never allow anyone in or out. And the countries that have shut their borders, it just means they're going to get this next year. Everyone has to catch this. 80% of us have to get it. And this is just part of the process. And, you have some states where they had these hard lockdowns. They tried to stop something that was inevitable. And you have Florida where they just don't give a shit.
That is one part. So you think it's actually, you think it's an actual conscious decision to go for herd immunity?
Well, there's no other choice. I mean, if you walk through all the options, all it does is defer everyone catching it while you destroy your economy. So Florida, which, is a tourism-driven economy, said we can't just kill our economy to defer this for 6 months. Let's just let it happen. And they said, let it rip. And then, you have, say, I live in South Beach. Our mayor here is, liberal, and he's trying to stop the inevitable. And so they closed the beach. It's stupid. July 4th weekend, big 3-day weekend, big for tourism, big for restaurants and bars. He closed all the bars and he closed the beach. So what does that do? I'm going to Fort Myers on Thursday. I'm going to have my 3-day weekend at the beach. All he's done is just hurt the local guys.
Okay, so let's think this through. Do you foresee a situation where you're adamant that you're going to push through? One of the worries that I have about that strategy is, what if all of a sudden everyone gets second thoughts, and you do get a situation where they go and they reverse harder than you would expect? Would you not argue? Yeah, so you don't worry about that. So are you therefore viewing this as long as the hospitals can handle the amount of new patients, then everything's fine, and that's going to continue as is? Is that kind of your thinking, your playbook?
Yeah, I mean, there's no other option, really. They need to slow it down enough so that the hospitals can function. And other than that, it's just going to happen.
Okay, so what does that mean for the stock market and the economy?
Well, for the stock market, I think we probably go higher because they just dumped a lot of liquidity in, and everything's reopening, and all this liquidity is going to find a home, and it usually finds a home in the stock market. I mean, look, Jay Powell is sitting there, and he's thinking of more acronyms to use to dump more money into the market.
Running out of letters. He should take a cue from Dave Portnoy and use the Scrabble bag of letters.
I mean, we're at the point now where you can literally just send in your baseball cards and he'll repo them. And then you have Congress, and look, there's an election coming up, and everyone wants to hand free money to people. I've lost track of which stimulus number. Is it 4 or 5? But they're going to send more money to people. Look, this is going to be really good for the stock market. I think. And the other thing is just boggles the mind is all my friends are short, all my friends are bearish, all my friends are suddenly, armchair virologists, and they have all this data about viruses where they have no idea what the hell they're talking about, really. I mean, who cares? Yes, every day will be worse in terms of the number of people who catch it. Every day will probably be worse in terms of the number of people who die of this thing, but it doesn't matter. I mean, that's yesterday's news. I mean, tomorrow's news is they're going to send $1,000 to everyone, and they're all going to go out and spend it. I mean, that's the real news that matters.
Right. I got it. So the reality is that if you're not, you don't think the world's going to end, what do you think is going to happen with other other asset classes? Like, do you expect that the dollar is going to react poorly to this increased?
Absolutely.
Oh, you do? Like, just because there's going to be more dollars created from all of the bad news?
I mean, I don't know. There's these people going around with this crazy story about there being a dollar shortage. I mean, as we've learned, the Fed can print unlimited dollars, and at the slightest drop of bad news, they'll print more dollars. I mean, they print dollars when we have a down day in the market. I don't see how you can have a dollar shortage when there's too many dollars, really. And they've promised to produce more dollars. No, I think the U.S. dollar trades down over time because we're printing them faster than other people.
So what do you view as the end game? How do you think this plays out? So if it happens like you say, let's just imagine you keep pushing through in terms of the virus. They decide they're not going to close everything. They're going to continue it, and they're going to basically meet everything in terms of any setbacks with more liquidity. How do you think that plays out in the market? Is there something that finally stops them from like going too far, or does something blow up? Like what happens?
Ultimately, you're going to have inflation. I mean, that's the end results. And there'll be too much inflation, and it'll force their hand in some way. I don't know if they'll actually pull back, or they'll just be like, meh, inflation's going at 10%. We're okay with that. We're just going to keep going forward because it's popular. But I really do think you need to look at Project Zimbabwe. I talked about this, a couple months ago, but I think that's the playbook you need to look at. Zimbabwe being a basket case country where they just kept printing money, first to enrich themselves, and then to give favors out to friends, and support local industries, give money to people to win the elections, blah blah blah. They just kept printing more and more money, and eventually the economy choked on Zim dollar. But the stock market went up 100% every day. Like every day, it just doubled for 10 years. And, I don't think we're going to do it that drastic here in America. We're going to do Project Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe Light. But I think that's the model you should have as your mental framework where things go up.
So what do you think that means 5% inflation, 10% inflation? Like, what do you foresee in the next year? Let's just say next summer we're talking. What do you think will be the worst CPI tick that we've had in that time?
Well, I mean, the CPI is a bastardized sort of data point to begin with. I mean, there's a lot of alternative inflation gauges that are showing a high single-digit inflation right now, and I think they're pretty accurate. I don't know. I think we'll have more inflation, but it's really hard to say. That might be a little too technical. I'm more of a stock market guy. I just know that if you print money, stocks go up, and if you write puts while the stock market's going up, look, I think I can harvest my 10% a month, and I think that's going to pay me better than being long. So I don't think the market itself goes up 10% a month.
One of the interesting things is, back to your idea about writing puts and the kind of concept that everyone thinks that when stocks go up, volatility has to go down, in terms of that relationship. They forget that in the 90s, after the long-term capital, we had a period when actually the stock market rose at a crazy rate. The NASDAQ doubled and then doubled again in less than 2 years. And yet during that whole period, volatility was actually rising, not falling.
Well, do you think that's just because market makers who were selling calls kept getting run over? So they would just keep stepping back, from the bid-ask spread, which is, effectively raising implied volatility. You think that's the reason, or there's something else structural?
No, so usually when a stock goes up in the old days, and this is right to your point about the fact that stocks that used to be $1 and used to go up 20 cents are now going up $2 and they're going up to $3. It used to be that the real worries, as a market maker that was short volatility, was that the stocks went down faster than they went up. And if that's the case, then therefore it's always easier to be, if stocks go up in a nice leisurely pace, then it's easy to be short those options because there's no worries there. What you really need to worry about is when things go down, because they go down really quick. Well, if you get a situation where they start to go up just as fast as they go down, then there's no reason why the smile has to be the Elvis Presley kind of Kirk smile. It could actually be a regular smile. And if you go look at more traditional, instruments, something different, for example, gold, the smile, I believe, I haven't checked it lately, but is kirked the other way, because what people worry about is the gold move, up $1,000, and it's more likely to go up $1,000 than it is down $1,000.
Right.
So therefore, the smile is actually the opposite. And this is the point that just because stocks are going up doesn't mean volatility has to be lower. And it's something that just drives me insane because too many people seem to think, oh, stocks go up, vol goes down. Yes, traditionally it does. Doesn't have to be that way. So let's talk about gold. Gold, as we write this, we're taping this on Tuesday afternoon. It just broke out to a new high. I don't want to Gucci it, but what are you thinking?
Well, gold's going to go much, much higher. I think it's inevitable. If you print dollars and everyone else prints their own currency, you have the one currency that they're not printing very fast. I mean, gold, they're printing at 2% a year. So, of course, it's going to outperform because everything else is kind of devaluing against gold. No, I think gold goes a lot higher over time.
Do you see – sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Do you see a situation right now where – traditional regular accounts or even your buddies that were generally, not gold bugs are starting to get interested in it? Because to me, that's really what we need to get. We need to get regular accounts, that those who aren't usually having gold allocation saying, I need to own some of this as an insurance. And if that happens, it could be explosive. I think I go back to that Grant Williams presentation, 0.15 of the pension assets were in gold or gold related instruments. If it went from 0.15 to 0.3, it would basically be the market cap of the entire GDX stock universe. It's huge. Gold is so small versus everything else. So to me, the real question is, are regular accounts finally accepting this, and are they starting to chase it? What are you seeing out there?
Well, I mean, it's gold's going up. Clearly, someone's buying it.
Right. But do you see an attitude change in your friends, or are they still those ones that were skeptical are still skeptical and not buying?
I don't have any friends who are skeptical of gold because all my friends are pretty rational people. I mean, I would say most of my friends. Sorry, I didn't mean it snarky.
That's all right.
But look, most of my friends are like me. We bought a ton of Krugerrands like 10, 15 years ago because we thought the world was going to end. And look, my Krugerrands have done very well. I paid like $300-400 for them. And, it's been a nice trade. But, they just kind of sitting around in my sock drawer. I don't know what to do with them. And, I feel like a lot of my friends bought it, but they've missed the last $100-200. I feel like a lot of my friends are out waiting for a pullback or, the other problem with gold, I mean, the real problem with it is it doesn't really move. I mean, yeah, it's up $300 this year, but that's like 20%. It's not like a big move. And then you look around your screen and, you have all these stocks that are doubling and tripling in a week. And gold's kind of this like boring thing. And, my friends are in the performance business because that's how we get paid. So you got to go own something that's going to move. And so I feel like a lot of my friends haven't been in gold. If gold starts really moving, they're going to have to get back in.
Right. So I that actually makes me feel much better because the last thing I'd want to hear is that everyone is long because then there'd be nobody left to buy. Kuppy, I contend that before this is over, we will have $1,000 gold week up. That's what's going to happen. It's going to be like 400 one day, 300, and then another 300. Because when it starts to move, it's going to be like one of these stocks that you talk about, the PO, the Polar or whatever it is. There's just not going to be enough liquidity for the big guys.
Well, they're going to end up running over all the shorts on COMEX, and it's
right.
Something big's going to happen. Yeah, absolutely. And I think gold's going to trend for a very, very long time. I think everyone should own gold. I think it's going to be a great place to be. I think there's better things you can own, but yeah, I think gold's great.
So let's talk about our other favorite stock, which is the Nikola. I always kind of think of Ricola, the commercial. There's a.
Oh, I think of. Well, I had the warrants, so I kept thinking of them as White Claw. White Claw.
That's right.
What a disgusting drink.
What's the rule? What's the line? There's no laws when you're drinking the claws. I think there's something like that.
But I kept telling people I'm long White Claw, and everyone's like, "What's White Claw?" I'm like, "Oh, Nick Claw."
When you wrote that piece, I saw some people that were just shaking their heads at the insanity of you recognizing that this was a bubble and looking at this company and saying, I know this is a bubble, but I think this is a great opportunity. I am going to ride that bubble. And I felt like you were like George Soros. George Soros says, when I see a bubble, I buy it. And that is such a hard thing to do, to recognize something as a bubble and yet to jump on. Hats off to you. Well done. Tell us the story.
Yeah, sure. So Nikola, they make EV trucks, or actually they don't make EV trucks. It's a stock promote that will one day, promised EV trucks. It's like a $30 billion company. And because it's a SPAC, it came out with these warrants. And the warrants let you buy the shares at 11.5. But there's a lot of different wrinkles on the warrants, and there's a lot of ways that the management team can screw you over with the warrants. There's a 10-day moving average. They can force convert you. They can not register your shares. It's kind of like going into a minefield and just kind of like dancing around and hope you don't step on anything too stupid. But I looked at these warrants. I looked at the spread to intrinsic, and they were trading like $40 under intrinsic. And I said to myself, I'll take my chances because that's a really big spread, and a lot of bad things can happen, and it's already priced in bad things happening. And so, I bought the warrants. I bought them in the low 20s. I tossed mine in the high 30s. I almost doubled my money in like 10 trading days. I wrote about it on my blog too. Right before they kind of went parabolic. But, you and I, Kevin, we talked about this quite a lot, about how to get screwed, and we invented some creative ways. Why don't you walk people through how you hedged it? Because I thought it was pretty smart.
Well, so one of the things that for me that I was scared about, I wasn't as comfortable just getting long the fraud, as you say. I have more trouble buying a company that's inherently worth nothing than you do. So I went and I actually entered into what's known as an option, like a synthetic forward. See, one of the problems with this stock is that there is no borrow. The borrow is actually, what do we see, 800, 900%?
Something like
the
that.
Borrow rate. And for those who
961.
don't... 961. So what's amazing about this is that if you go and figure out how much this stock has to go up or down every day as a short seller for you to earn that 961 back, it immediately becomes kind of more clear as to why you might want to be long the warrants. Because implicit in the warrant price is that that borrow fee. Because if it wasn't implicit in there, then what people would do is they would go and hedge it through buying the warrant and shorting the stock. They would go the other way. They would short the warrant, buy the stock, and then earn the fee. Right? Because don't forget, although most people can't earn the fee, institutions and hedge funds can earn the fee. So anyways, the long and short of it is that you have to go and put that fee in there. And I think that fee works out to $1.30 a day, meaning that every single day that you're short that stock, that stock has to go down by $1.30. Otherwise, you have lost money on it. So one of the things that I did was I said, I'm not comfortable just being long the warrants. I'm going to go and I'm going to do a synthetic forward. So I actually bought the put and sold the call to create a situation where I wasn't short the stock, today, but that I will be short at the time when these warrants become exercisable. And for that kind of privilege, I had to pay what is the borrow fee for all those. So that synthetic is actually trading what? I can't remember, $15 lower than the stock price because I did 20 days or something, or I can't remember what the number was, something like that. So I basically said, I'm going to buy the warrants. I'm going to short the stock. I don't need to worry about getting bought in because I'm not short the actual stock, and I have already locked in my rate that I'm going to charge. And then hopefully when those warrants become exercisable, which is really the whole game here, I'll just kind of, be made short as my options expire, and then I'll exercise my warrants, and Bob's your uncle, and hopefully that's the profit that I make.
Right. I mean, let's hope it works right. This is like 15 different ways you can get screwed. But
right, because there is a complication where they could change it on a VWAP, but we went through the math. We're okay there.
The VWAP's around 68. It's about 67.5 right now.
Yeah. So it is a complicated, strange game. It's kind of one of the things though that people that believe it's fundamentally undervalued is because it's not listed on Robinhood. Right, those warrants aren't listed on Robinhood, so all the Robinhood guys or folks are buying the Nikola and they're not buying the warrants.
It's just weird that in this day and age, with so many smart people in this world, that you could have a $40 arbitrage on something that trades tens of millions of dollars a day.
But there wasn't a $40 arbitrage because when you put in the cost of the borrow, that arbitrage, which is part that I did, went down to 10. So really,
which
it was
still a lot of arbitrage for 2 weeks.
Right, but then we're not sure if the stock if it's going to get registered, right? So this whole thing about they could screw us on that, and not only that, after the Virgin Galactic, where they did screw all the warrant holders, or didn't screw them, made it complicated. It's not an easy instrument to hedge. It's not the easiest of instruments, and then combined with the fact I think everyone is doing it. That's why it's a 900% borrow fee.
Right.
If nobody was doing it, they would be 10 or whatever. But just for those who are playing along at home, just go if you want to kind of see the difference in terms of the synthetic forward, go make yourself take a 1 month option and figure out what the put costs and figure out what the call costs, and then figure out where you basically are shorting it going forward, and then take another stock that's around $70 with a much more regular borrow fee and look at those that put call parity. And then people are going to go, no, but it has to do with volatility. No, because don't forget that the call and the put would both be higher and it would still work out the same because you're taking the put minus the call. Anyways, it's fun for those, that are interested in option theory. It's very interesting, but it ends up being that this borrow fee is super important and it's just crazy. And more with these stocks getting squeezed, this is the whole game, is to figure out the borrow. Because
going back to your, us talking about high implied volatility, if you or I were to sit down and be like, yeah, we're going to gamma screw the market maker on Thursday, we're going to buy these out of the money calls when there's no theta left. And we're going to, it's a $70 stock and we're going to buy the 75 calls for 10 cents on Thursday afternoon. And if we did that, it'd be illegal. We'd all go to prison. If Robinhood does this and they put it on a message board and they all do it with 10 lots at a time, everyone kind of ignores it. And the market maker but it's true. And then the market maker gets run over. We've seen this structurally done on Virgin Galactic and Tilray and a bunch of these other ones. But that's why implied volatility is so high. And it's also why, I'm not selling calls. I don't sell calls. But, you can go into something like this Nikola and be a few dollars out of the money and write puts and get paid a few dollars for 3 days of risk. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, that's right. It's because of the borrow as well because don't forget that's implicit in the put price as well. And that's why that's there. Now, back to your thing that it would be illegal for us to do it. Yes, it would be illegal for us to do it. But don't think there aren't some very famous hedge funds out there that used to love getting the dealer short some lines and then squeezing it in the last minutes and then offering it them out, outs. Because there's some very, very famous hedge funds that were notorious for that strategy. Now, they didn't do it. They didn't do it the same way, and then they were quick to take it off. The Robinhooders just seem to let it all ride. That's the difference between the two of them.
Right. And they get the dealers all short, common and short-term options, and then they rip it. I have a question for you. How do you think the advent of weekly options on almost every stock, like Nikola has weekly options, how do you think that has structurally impacted overall implied volatility? Because my gut feel is that it's actually structurally risen. It's increased volatility. It's kind of how I see it.
I would say that if you're getting a situation where there's enough buyers that are actually overwhelming the market, then you're probably correct.
And I think these 1 week calls are allowing people to basically control more stock with less dollars because there's less theta in them. And it's I think it's just ratcheting the entire curve up. It's just kind of structurally how I'm seeing it.
Right now, just so you're aware that before COVID, one of the strategies that the that the pension funds love to do was selling 1 week options. And it had something to do with the fact that there's some regulated in I don't know if it's banks or somebody. It made sense for them to be long these things kind of just systematically because it reduced their capital required. So there was a natural buyer in the market always for these things that just systematically overpaid. And so what would happen was the pension plans would come and systematically sell it. I think they, as usual, they took it and they did too much of it, and they actually made it so that these things were dirt cheap. And it's great for the retail investor that wants to speculate, no doubt about it. There's lots. And it's crazy because you see some people, like I remember seeing this before COVID. There was some account on Reddit that had bought 1,000 of some option at a penny. And then the thing, you remember when Tesla took off?
Yeah.
The option went from a penny to $100. And so the guys, I don't know the math, is that $10 million? Like he made, it was a stupid number though that he made. And then he took his $10 million and just bought some more. Like it's just like these guys they're just cowboys. They're cowboys.
Yeah, they are. But I think that's structurally pulling the entire vol curve higher. And it's not just names like Tesla and Nikola, because, I mean, if Nikola's going off at 200 vols or 300 vols, well, my Smith & Wesson's going off at 100 vol. And, something totally boring and prosaic like Twitter's going off at 70 vol. I mean, Twitter's not a 70 vol name. It's a boring stock that's been range bound between 20 and 30 for my entire investment career. It's not a 70 vol name. But it lets you write puts and make 15% a month. It makes no sense.
Right. And that's back to the idea of the pension plan stepped away. There's very few sellers of this. So structurally, you're stepping into somewhere that's it's underserved. There's a lot of buyers and there's not enough sellers. And so therefore, if you're smart about it, you can make a portfolio. Listen, I know you don't like selling calls. The other thing you can do, though, is you can figure out ways to do, you can sell call spreads. There is ways as well, if you're bearish that way, of creating strategies to take advantage of the higher vols that have limited risk. You don't need to be exposed to unlimited risk like in a takeover or whatever. And I completely get it. Those are scary situations. At least when you're short the put, what you've lost. But you can create strategies on options where you can sell upside volatility and have limited liability. We'll get you trading those later.
I used to, every once in a while, I'll be in one of these like super high vol names. I'll write the puts and I'll be like, for every 10 puts, let me sell 2 calls. I'll just kind of lay it off a little. And I would say that every single time I've ever done that, the puts went out worthless and I lost so much money on the calls that I literally made no money on the trade. I don't do it anymore.
Okay. Well, listen, it's been great chatting with you. Is there anything is there anything I forgot to bring up? I'm trying to think about like what we were going to talk about. I'm pretty sure we got everything, unless there's something you wanted to, you weren't going to tell me that you were going to sneak in here.
No.
So what do you got plans for the July 4 weekend?
I'm going to go see a friend out in Fort Myers. We rented a place for 3 days. It's, 2.5 hour drive. So it's great. The beach is still open there, unlike the Nazis here that closed our beach. Right. I'm probably going to drink too much beer and get a tan.
So here's a question. Mask or no mask?
No mask, of course not.
Oh, there we go. Kuppy has spoken. No mask. For those who are playing, interested in Kuppy's Corner and were worried about him last week, we've decided to change him to the first of the month. So Kuppy will be on the first of the month going forward from now on. Thanks for being with us today, Kuppy.
Sure thing.
Take care. Happy 4th of July.
Thanks.
Well, that's it for our main show this week. We appreciate you tuning in. We couldn't do the show without you, and I'd like to thank both George Gammon and Harris Kupperman for great interviews this week. And if you like something on the show, please share it with your friends. Don't forget you can listen to the Market Huddle on all the networks: Google Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, Android Play, iTunes, and YouTube. A lot of people watch on YouTube to see all of our charts and visuals, and while you're there, please like and subscribe to get our latest content. Follow us on Twitter at The Market Huddle. We're on Twitter every day. Give Lena a shout out. And if you could, please rate us on iTunes. It helps us out immensely. Where can they find you, Patrick?
You can find me on Twitter at Patrick Ceresna and at bigpicturetrading.com. Where can they find you, Kev?
They can find me on Twitter at Kevin Muir, M-U-I-R, or you can follow me on my newsletter at themacrotourist.substack.com.
And just for all of our American listeners, enjoy your 4th of July long weekend. And thank you, everyone, for listening. You can't have too many friends. Bull market, bear market. They're just happy to spend some time together in this crazy ride. So thanks for joining us, everybody.
Have a great long weekend, everyone.
That was a good show. Too bad Lena. We can't tell Lena to hop on here, Kev.
No.
No, that was fun. Listen, everyone, we're going to get back to our normal format next week. Kev, you doing anything for this long weekend?
No, I'm not. I'm actually pretty boring. Just hanging in the house. How about you?
Actually, pretty boring. I made plans actually for the last couple of weeks of July when we're going to do our little summer specials. But for this weekend anyway, I'm laying low.
Yeah, well, let's just hope everyone stay safe, enjoy your weekend, and we'll catch you next week.
All right. We'll be back to our normal show format next week. Thanks, everyone.